When I was a kid at a boarding school out in the suburbs, something happened that still unsettles me. The school was old, 1,920 seconds, kind of old, with dark wood halls and the stale smell of disinfectant. I shared a room with a quiet boy named Weston. Our room was simple: 2 beds, 2 desks, 1 vent above the door, a dusty, metal relic of the original building. At first, I ignored the faint scratching sounds that came from it late at night. The place creaked. Old buildings did that. But the sounds grew consistent, always starting around 2:30 a.m. A rhythmic pattern of scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. Too precise to be random. When I asked Weston if he heard it, he barely looked up from his calculus book. Old pipes. Stop listening for it, and it'll stop. I tried, but once you notice a sound like that, it becomes impossible to ignore. The rhythm felt deliberate, like work. One night, I decided to test it. When the scratching started, I cleared my throat loudly. Ahem! The noise stopped. Instantly. The silence afterward felt thick and alive. After a few minutes, the sound returned, but changed. It was now a slow tapping, deliberate, heavy, right against the metal. Tap, tap, tap. Then came something worse, a faint, dry cough from behind the grate. It wasn't pipes. It wasn't wind. Someone was in there. The next day, I couldn't focus. The thought that someone was crawling through the vents haunted me. That night, I climbed onto a crate, pressed my face close to the grate, and whispered, "Hello, who is that?" For a long moment, nothing. Then, a whisper came back. Dry, dusty, male right at my ear. "Stop that." I fell backward, breath caught in my throat. It wasn't imagination. Someone was there. I pulled the blanket to my chin, frozen, staring at the black vent. Then came a low, heavy thump from inside, slow and steady, like a hand pressing against the duct. It wasn't random noise. It was communication, a warning, a claim. I didn't sleep. When morning came, Weston went about his routine, unaffected. I asked if he'd heard anything. "Nightmare," he said flatly. "You're stressed." His logic made sense, but logic couldn't erase that voice. I turned to my friend Mark, a dramatic overreactor, but a believer. When I told him everything, he went pale. "Dude, that's insane. What if it's some escaped convict? We've got to tell Mr. Harrison." I stopped him. "Not yet. We need proof." Days passed in torment. I stopped listening to music, afraid to miss any noise. I even dressed in the closet, convinced eyes were on me. Then it escalated. One afternoon, I came back from practice. The room felt wrong. Still. My compass, a cheap plastic one my grandfather gave me, was gone from my desk. I searched everywhere. Weston hadn't touched it. Then I looked up and saw it. A tiny circular scratch on the inside lip of the vent, like a mark left by a compass point. Whoever was inside had taken it. They'd reached into my space. That night, Mark sneaked into the room with a flashlight. We waited. The sound started earlier this time, 1 a.m. It began as frantic scrabbling, then gasping, choking noises. It didn't sound human at first, then suddenly, it did. Someone was suffocating in there. Mark clapped a hand over his mouth. Even Weston woke up, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "That's it," I whispered. "Someone's in there. Call Mr. Harrison." The dorm master arrived minutes later, robe wrapped tight, irritated. We pointed at the vent. "There's someone inside. We heard them choking." He fetched a chair, unscrewed the grate, his light slicing into the duct. "Empty, dusty, silent, probably a rat," he said. "Or heating noise." He screwed the grate back, satisfied. But as he turned away, I saw it a pale blue thread caught on the metal edge. The exact color of our school pajama pants. I said nothing. The watcher wasn't a ghost. They were one of us, someone small, desperate, and hidden in the walls. Someone who had heard me whisper, and who had whispered back. After that night, the noises stopped completely. No scratching, no tapping, no whispering. Weston was thrilled proof, in his mind, that it had all been in my head. Mark avoided me, shaken by what we'd heard. I should have been relieved too, but the silence was worse. It wasn't peace. It was a retreat. Whoever or whatever had been there was now hiding, deeper inside the walls. I couldn't stop thinking about the blue fabric thread. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. A student, maybe, who'd found a way to live inside the school's old ductwork. The thought made me sick. They'd heard us, seen us, maybe even breathed the same air through that vent for months. And I'd exposed them. I moved through the next week like a ghost. I avoided the dorm, stayed late in the library, and tried to act normal. But every time I passed the hall leading to my room, I'd feel it, that faint shift in pressure, like eyes watching from behind the walls. One night, I woke up to a noise. Not from the vent this time, from the hallway. A faint dragging sound, like fabric brushing over tile. I froze. Weston was asleep. The sound passed our door, slow and deliberate, then stopped. Silence. Then, one single tap against the metal frame of the vent. Just one. Then nothing. That was the night I decided to move out. I told Mr. Harrison I'd developed a severe allergy to the building's old air ducts. He didn't question it, probably relieved to have one less paranoid kid keeping him up at night. They moved me to another room on the opposite end of the dormitory. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No noises, no eyes in the dark. The new room smelled of fresh paint and new carpet. Sterile but safe. Weston barely said goodbye. We both pretended the vent ordeal hadn't happened. Still, the unease didn't leave me. I'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I'd heard a faint breath or whisper somewhere beyond the walls. I'd tell myself it was just memory, residual fear, until one morning, while packing my old things, I opened my desk drawer and froze. My compass was there, perfectly placed in the middle of the drawer, spotless. I hadn't seen it since it disappeared. I touched it, the plastic was cold, too cold. The school had no air conditioning running in October. Someone had put it there recently. Someone who still had access to my room. Or worse, someone who knew exactly where to find me. I told myself it was impossible, but the fear had logic of its own. Whoever was in the vents had followed me, or at least wanted me to think they had. I wrapped the compass in tissue, locked it in my suitcase, and tried to forget it existed. Life at the boarding school went on. Classes, exams, routine. The strange incident became something I filed away. A private nightmare that I told no one about after graduation. Weston and I never spoke again. Mark dropped out a year later. For a long time, I managed to convince myself it had been a hallucination born of stress and sleeplessness. But years later, when I was in college, I stumbled across a local news article online. Abandoned boarding school building to be demolished. It was my old school. The photo showed the same wing, where my dorm had been windows boarded, bricks cracked. What made me stop scrolling was a paragraph buried in the article. During preliminary inspection, maintenance workers discovered signs of long-term human habitation within the ventilation system of the West Dormitory. Small personal items were found inside blankets, food wrappers, and fragments of student uniforms believed to date back several years. I felt my stomach drop. There it was, the confirmation I'd never wanted. Someone had been in there, living in the ducts, listening, watching, maybe even sleeping above us while we dreamed below. That night, I dug out the compass from an old box. I hadn't looked at it in years. Its once clear plastic was now cloudy with age, the tiny needle frozen in place. But around the rim, barely visible in the light, was a thin gray smear, metal dust, maybe from the vent's interior. I couldn't bring myself to clean it. Sometimes I imagine that person. A boy, maybe a runaway, maybe a student who'd gone missing, trapped by fear or madness in that labyrinth of ducts. I imagine him crawling through narrow shafts, watching through the grates as life continued without him. How many nights had he stared down at us, breathing dust, listening to our whispers? How many times had he reached out through the metal, just to feel connection? And I imagine the night I whispered to him, how those two words stopped that weren't anger, but desperation. Maybe I'd threatened the fragile world he'd built. Maybe I'd scared him more than he scared me. But some nights, when the house is still, I hear faint tapping through the heating vent above my bed. Not loud enough to be certain, just enough to make me hold my breath and listen. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch. And even though I tell myself it's nothing, pipes, wind, whatever, I always whisper the same words before I can stop myself. Okay, I'll stop. Then I wait, staring into the dark, wondering if somewhere, in some other wall, someone's listening back. I think my most profound moment of childhood dread didn't come from a spooky story or a dark basement, but from something incredibly mundane, a yard sale. This was back in the late 90s, maybe 98 or 99. Summer in the suburbs meant three things: too much humidity, riding bikes until the streetlights came on, and yard sales every Saturday morning. I was about 14, and my friend Mike was with me. Mike was the skeptic in my life then, the kind of friend who would fact-check a ghost story on the spot. We were cruising down Willow Creek Lane, a street known for having the best junk. That's where we found it, on a card table, stacked with dusty paperbacks and tangled Christmas lights. It was a single VHS tape. Most of the tapes were labeled things like Disney World 94 or Aunt Carol's Wedding. This one had a spine that was clean and white, only marked with a thick black Sharpie. WR, nothing else. No date, no subject, just those two letters. It was a quarter. I bought it. "Why'd you get that?" Mike asked, wrinkling his nose as I turned the tape over in my hand. It was heavier than a normal VHS, and the plastic shell felt slick with years of accumulated grime. "I don't know," I said. "It just feels like it shouldn't be here." The feeling was one of intense curiosity, the kind that overrides common sense. It felt like I was holding a secret that had been accidentally left out on a table for 25 cents. We went back to my house. My parents were out, and the basement was cool and dark, the perfect place to watch something we probably shouldn't. I jammed the tape into my VCR, hit play, and sat back. For the first 10 minutes, Mike's skeptic theory seemed right. It was exactly what you'd expect from an old, unlabeled tape. Shaky footage of a suburban backyard. A birthday party, maybe a 5th birthday. A little girl, whose face was perpetually out of focus, was blowing out candles. Her name wasn't mentioned, but the camera operator kept repeating, "WR, smile," as she tried to wrestle with a party hat. WR was presumably the little girl. Then, at the 10:45 mark, the footage stopped abruptly. Not a clean cut, but a sudden, violent shift. The screen went black and green, the specific, grainy static of an old camera being covered or dropped. "See?" Mike said, leaning back. Someone hit the pause button and then accidentally recorded over the good stuff. Just a busted home movie. 25 cents well spent. I didn't hit eject. I told Mike to be quiet and I cranked the volume. The visual was gone, replaced by the flickering dark, but the audio was still running. At first, it was just the rustle of fabric, the scraping of the camera housing on a rough surface, maybe a carpet. Then, faint and muffled, came voices. Not happy birthday voices. It was an argument. A low, gravelly male voice and a higher-pitched female voice. They were indistinct, submerged beneath the hiss of the tape, but the tone wasn't indistinct. It was heated, venomous, and laced with a terror that radiated through the cheap speakers. We spent the next 15 minutes, which was the entire remaining length of the tape, listening to the darkness. Mike became completely silent, his disbelief slowly giving way to uncertainty. We were trying to decode the whispers, to find the single clear word that would tell us what we were witnessing. The male voice was the loudest. It was punctuated by heavy, ragged breathing. We could only make out pieces. "I told you, not in front of her. This is how it is, always." The female voice was pleading, broken by what sounded like small, wet sobs. "Just let me, please." Then, the clearest sound. A heavy, dull thud, followed by a sudden, high-pitched shriek. It wasn't the shriek of a cartoon or a movie. It was the sound of a small child, WR, who had heard something awful and couldn't process the pain. Mike finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Dude, turn it off. This is bad. This isn't a joke." "No," I whispered. My own heart was racing. We were listening to a real moment of domestic terror, a secret recorded accidentally and then sold for a quarter. This was a true, personal horror, and the guilt of witnessing it, of possessing it, was immense. The fear had definitely arrived. The audio continued to roll. The sounds of struggle, a crash, and then a long, empty, terrifying silence, punctuated only by the faint sound of a woman's ragged, struggling breath. the sound of someone trying to be silent while in profound pain. The VCR was chewing up the tape. It was nearly at the end. I was leaning forward, my ear pressed against the speaker, trying to hear the final, defining word. And then, just as the audio cut out completely and the tape reached its mechanical end, the screen flashed. It was a split-second flicker, not even a full half-second, but the darkness was suddenly ruptured by a bright, blurry image. The camera, presumably, had been knocked or shifted, and its lens momentarily caught something recognizable before the tape ran out entirely. The image was unfocused and chaotic, but in the center there was a specific landmark. A green and white street sign mounted on a thin metal pole. The street sign was slightly obscured by overgrown hedges, but the light was bright enough to make out the capital letters on the pole. The street was familiar. It was the cross-section of Creekwood Drive and Oak Terrace. My blood went cold. Creekwood Drive was 3 streets over. Oak Terrace was the next block. It wasn't just a random tape from a random family. It was a local tragedy, recorded and buried, and now it was sitting in my VCR. I scrambled to hit the rewind button, my hands shaking. I needed to see that image again. Mike was staring at the blank screen, his face pale. That's Mrs. Albright's corner, he stammered, naming the woman who lived on that exact intersection. We passed that corner every day to get to the mall. The terror shifted. It was no longer the terror of a hidden person, but the terror of proximity. The trauma we had just listened to wasn't a world away. It was recorded right down the street, and now I possessed the proof of it. The tape began to spin backward with a high-pitched whine. I was desperate to reconfirm the street sign, to make sure my memory wasn't betraying me. I had to know the source of the voices, and why this piece of evidence was sold for $25 at a yard sale. If a crime had happened, did I just acquire the key? And if so, what did I do with it? The answer, I knew, was somewhere in that small plastic shell. The tape finally rewound, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. The sheer audacity of what we held, an accidental confession, a piece of someone's worst night, was paralyzing. We were 14-year-old boys in a dark basement, holding evidence of a potential catastrophe that happened blocks from my house. The panic was starting to set in. "We have to watch it again," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Just the end. I need to be sure of that street sign." Mike, the skeptic, who was now fully converted, was pacing. No. We shouldn't have watched it at all. We need to take this to someone. The police. Like, right now." I hesitated. The police. That meant explaining the quarter tape, the home movie turned argument, and the sudden glimpse of a street sign. I imagined the desk sergeant's patronizing dismissal. 2 boys with a grainy VCR tape? Go home, son. I needed undeniable proof. I replayed the final 10 seconds. The black screen. The hiss. Then, the flash. The green and white sign. Creekwood Drive. It was real. I hit eject. The tape lay on the carpet, an innocent-looking object now charged with a sinister energy. My mind was racing. If the struggle on the tape was recent, and the people were still in the house, I could be putting myself or WR in danger by exposing the tape. If it was old, maybe it was a piece of local history, and the people involved were long gone. I needed the calm thinker. My older sister, Sarah, was home from college for the summer. She was 21, majoring in criminology, and always had a level head. I brought her downstairs. "Sarah, you have to hear this, but you can't tell Mom and Dad. Promise." She listened to the whole thing, sitting still on the old, floral sofa, her expression unreadable. When the struggle began, her eyes narrowed. When the little girl shrieked, she winced, but didn't look away. When the tape ended, she didn't jump to conclusions like Mike. She gave me her calm thinker assessment. "The police won't touch this," she stated flatly. "It's circumstantial. There's no date, and the audio is too muffled to be used as evidence. It could be a movie, but you know it's not. The girl's initials are WR, and she was 5 in the first shot. The sign is a local street. It's too specific to be a coincidence." She picked up the tape, examining the white label and the Sharpie mark. "We don't call the police. We do a reconnaissance." The guilt of being a passive witness to this private horror was eating me alive. I felt a desperate need for survival, not just for me, but for the ghost of WR that the tape had resurrected. Later that night, Around 11:30 p.m., Sarah drove Mike and me over to the corner of Creekwood Drive and Oak Terrace. The houses were big, older Tudors, set back from the road behind high, neat hedges. The street was silent. The yard sale was on Willow Creek, Sarah said quietly. If a family sold the tape, they probably lived near here. We parked a block away and walked up. Sarah had a small, powerful digital camera, an expensive piece of college gear. Okay. The tape was labeled WR, Sarah whispered. What if that's the house number? We walked past the houses on Creekwood, looking for a number plate or mail slot with the letters WR. We found nothing. Then, we rounded the corner onto Oak Terrace. It was the third house on the block. The house was dark, utterly silent. A heavy, ivy-covered brick structure. On the mailbox, professionally stenciled in gold leaf, were the letters. The Roach House. Roach. W-R-W Roach. My heart plummeted. My hands started to sweat. It wasn't the initials. It was the name. The little girl, W.R., was a roach. The name was common enough, but given the tape's origin and the street sign, the possibility was paralyzing. Sarah was still the calm thinker. She walked up the stone pathway, motioning for us to stay hidden in the shadows by a massive oak tree. She moved slowly, deliberately, not like a teenager, but like a detective. She peered into the front window, her hand cupped to block the streetlight. She came back, her face grim. No sign of anyone, she whispered. But the house is mostly empty. Bare walls, a few boxes. It looks like they moved out, and quickly. So, what happened? I asked, my voice shaky. Did the police get involved after the tape was made? Was the yard sale part of an estate liquidation? Suddenly, Mike grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with panic. Look, he hissed, pointing to the porch. There, sitting on the corner of the small stone porch, facing the street, was a single, old-fashioned, cloth-bodied doll. It was the kind you see in antique shops, with button eyes and yarn hair, dressed in a faded yellow dress. It looked perfectly placed, not forgotten. And pinned to the dress, with a large, rusted safety pin, was a piece of paper. Sarah, moving on pure instinct, strode up and plucked the note. She didn't read it out loud. She just stared at it, her face going a shade of chalky white I'd never seen before. What is it? I demanded, stepping forward. She crumpled the note into a ball, shoving it into her pocket, and walked back to us with a terrifying, forced composure. We're leaving. Now. Get in the car. We didn't argue. We ran. Back in the safety of my driveway, with the car idling, she finally pulled the note out. Her hand was shaking. She smoothed out the paper. It was a small piece of lined notebook paper, clearly torn from a spiral binder. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an explanation. It was a transcript. The note was written in a clean, adult hand, but the words themselves were a direct, word-for-word quote from the most muffled, frantic part of the VHS audio, the part where the woman was struggling to speak, just before the final scream. It read, "Just let me, please." Underneath it, in the same handwriting, was a new message, an addendum. It was perfectly centered on the page. Thank you for bringing her home. Sarah was breathing heavily, her face white. Someone knew we were coming. Someone was waiting. The horror of the tape wasn't the violence it recorded. It was the chilling realization that the person who made the tape, the gravelly male voice, was still nearby. He had sold the tape on purpose, knowing that the street sign was a clue. He waited for the inevitably curious local to discover the secret, and he was waiting at the house to see who came to investigate. The doll and the note weren't just a sign of his knowledge, they were a sinister greeting. I had been pulled into the story, and the man who made the tape was still watching, tracking his own traumatic evidence to see who might be trying to follow it. The tape, WR, was not a forgotten piece of evidence. It was a highly calculated trap. I had done my good deed by trying to seek the truth for WR, but in doing so, I had made myself known to the person who recorded her worst moments, and the person who was waiting for an unexpected visitor. The persistent fear wasn't about the violence we heard, but the knowledge that somewhere out there, a man knew I had a copy of his most private, sinister memory. I never heard anything else about the Roach House. I never took the tape or the note to the police. I couldn't risk it. The note, crumpled in a box in my closet, is a constant, terrifying reminder that sometimes The most disturbing true stories are the ones that quietly pull you in and then leave you exposed to an unseen, waiting terror. This story is probably the hardest to tell because it deals with something that, even now, makes me doubt my own sanity. It happened when I was 10, living in a small, conservative town in upstate New York. It was the summer of 1995, and life was centered around the town square, dominated by the massive, Gothic Revival municipal building with its imposing clock tower. The clock tower was the town's pride, but it also carried a local, whispered history. Years ago, the story went, a young clock repair apprentice had fallen to his death inside the intricate machinery, a gruesome tangle of flesh and copper. Since then, the tower had been locked up, deemed unsafe, and only the town historian and the mayor had the key. My friend, Leo, was my overreactor. He lived and breathed local legends, always convinced that every creak and shadow was a spectral manifestation. His opposite was Simon, my calm thinker. Simon was relentlessly practical, a kid who would only believe what he could measure and touch. The three of us spent that summer trying to find a way into the clock tower. Leo saw it as a spiritual quest. Simon saw it as a structural challenge. I was motivated purely by the childish need for curiosity to see the forbidden. We finally found our way in, not through the front iron-barred door, but through a small, rusted maintenance hatch in the alleyway behind the building. It led into a cramped, dusty boiler room, and from there, a narrow, winding staircase ascended into the darkness. The climb was slow. The air was thick and smelled of ozone and ancient oil. When we finally reached the main clock room, a massive chamber with giant, glowing clock faces looming over the town, the sight was breathtaking. Huge, silent gears, thick as my torso, hung suspended in the dim light filtering through the clock faces. But it was what we found in the corner that stopped us. It was a small camp. Not for a squatter, the space was too clean, too organized. It was for a boy. A small, neatly made-up bedroll, a stack of worn paperback books, a few empty cans of beans, and a large wooden artist's easel with a canvas draped over it. Someone lives here, Leo breathed, his eyes wide. His overrector mind was already conjuring up visions of a feral ghost child. Simon, the calm thinker, knelt down. No one lives here. They use it. Look at the cans. They're all from the new grocery store. This is recent, maybe a runaway kid. The whole atmosphere shifted from adventure to a creeping uncertainty. We were trespassing on the private world of another person, someone who clearly needed this hiding spot. I couldn't resist the easel. I walked over and gently pulled the cloth off the canvas. It was a portrait. Not a great one. The technique was clumsy, but the subject was instantly recognizable. It was a painting of me. My heart seized in my chest. It wasn't just a picture of a random boy. It was me. It captured my features exactly, down to the small, crescent-shaped scar on my left eyebrow from a bike crash the previous year. But the eyes in the painting were wrong. They were too large, too dark, and they held an expression of profound, silent desperation that I had never felt, or at least had never known I projected. Behind me, Leo made a small, choked noise. He was looking at a second canvas, leaning against the wall. It was a portrait of him. Same desperate eyes, same meticulous detail, capturing the slight, nervous twitch he had in his jaw. Simon was already moving, checking the rest of the supplies. He found a third canvas. It was him. Simon, in all his practical stoicism, painted with those same hollow, terrified eyes. The silence in the clock tower became heavy, pressing. The realization was a paralyzing cold shot of fear. We weren't just being watched, we had been studied. We had been captured, and our hidden emotional states, the fear the artist projected onto us, had been rendered in oil paint. He knows us, I managed to whisper. He's seen us all. He's been watching us from up here. The clock face in front of me seemed to mock the observation. The three of us, who had spent the summer below, oblivious, had been the subjects of a silent, private art project in the Forbidden Tower. We didn't take anything. We didn't touch anything else. We fled, stumbling down the spiral staircase, scrambling back through the boiler room and the hatch. The urgency was a dizzying blend of panic and a desperate need for survival to get out of the sightline of the hidden artist. We didn't talk about it for a week. The paintings were real, they were terrifyingly accurate, and they were still up there. A week later, I was walking home alone from the library when I heard a familiar sound. It was the clock tower chiming the hour 4 p.m., but as the last, deep gong faded, a different sound followed. It was a rhythmic, metal-on-metal squeak. A slow, steady squeak, 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 coming from the very top of the tower, louder than any normal machinery noise. It sounded like the enormous, unseen gears inside the clock were turning, but not with the clean, oiled rhythm of timekeeping. It sounded like they were laboring, like something was jammed inside them. And then the squeaking stopped. A short, scraping noise followed, like heavy canvas being dragged across a stone floor. I looked up at the clock face directly above me. The glass was old, slightly convex, reflecting the town square. I could see the movement of the minute hand, still ticking. But in the very center of the reflected glass, in the absolute heart of the tower, I saw a flicker. A small, dark human silhouette briefly crossed the light of the clock face, pausing for just a second behind the 12 numeral. It was thin, with unkempt hair, and it was holding something large and rectangular, a canvas. The figure was clearly looking down at the street below. At me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew the silhouette was the boy. He wasn't just observing me from a safe distance anymore. He was making his presence known, showing me he was still up there, still working. I froze, paralyzed, staring at the reflection. I could feel the weight of his stare, the desperate, hollow eyes he had given me in the painting. He didn't wave, he didn't run. He just stood there, silhouetted, until the second hand swept past, and his form was swallowed again by the shadows and the intricate mechanism of the clock. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted all the way home, convinced that any delay would be an invitation. The sound of the grinding gears echoed in my ears long after I was safe behind my front door. The mystery had deepened into a silent, personal threat. What was he painting now, and why did he choose me and my friends as the only things worth capturing? The terror of the observation had become a psychological siege. We had intruded, and the boy had responded by showing us he was still present and watching. The paintings, once an unsettling discovery, now felt like a curse, a permanent, physical record of his obsession with us. I knew I couldn't live out the rest of the summer with the threat of those hollow eyes following me, so I convinced Leo and Simon that we had to go back up. We needed to destroy the paintings. Leo, the overreactor, was shaking. "No, man, this is exactly what he wants. We leave him alone. He's a weirdo, but if we go back, he'll think we're a threat. He'll come after us." Simon, the calm thinker, surprisingly agreed with me. "He's using our faces for something. That's a violation. We need to stop him, or at least figure out who he is. We leave no trace, just the paintings." Simon's voice was clipped, methodical. The logic of the invasion of privacy overruled the fear. 2 days later, at 1 a.m., under a moonless sky, we were back in the boiler room. The air was colder, the silence deeper. We scaled the rickety spiral staircase, our flashlights cutting through the dust motes. We reached the clock chamber. The gigantic gears were still, the air stagnant. The camp was gone. The bedroll, the books, the cans of beans, all gone. The floor was swept clean. It was as if no one had ever been there. My heart sank. He had moved. He had sensed our return, or perhaps he moved based on a schedule. Then, Simon shined his light on the corner where the easel had stood. Lying flat on the floor, perfectly centered, were the 3 paintings. Our portraits, the meticulous, terrible captures of our faces, with those wide, desperate, alien eyes. Next to them, there was a 4th canvas. It was the same size, but this one was still blank, waiting. I picked up my portrait. My scar was rendered perfectly. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline. We were not leaving until this evidence was gone. "We burn them," Leo whispered, his voice high and strained. "We light them up now." "No," Simon said, ever the pragmatist. "The smoke will bring the fire department. We have to take them down, put them in the backpack." We rolled the 3 completed canvases carefully and squeezed them into Simon's large hiker pack. The blank canvas we left behind. It was a sign. The project was abandoned. As we were turning to leave, Leo shined his light on the largest, main clock gear. It was a massive brass wheel, easily 10 feet in diameter, with hundreds of sharp, triangular teeth. Wedged between two of the gear's teeth, caught in the mechanism, was a piece of folded, thick paper. It looked like a page torn from a sketchbook. Leo, driven by morbid curiosity, scrambled onto the pedestal and delicately pulled the paper free. It was stiff, and there were faint smudges of oil paint on the corners. He opened it. It wasn't a note. It was a detailed pencil sketch of the interior of the clock room, but it wasn't a blueprint. It was a visual plan. The sketch detailed the exact location of the maintenance hatch, the staircase, the main gear, and the three of us small stick figure representations entering the chamber. It was a reflection of our movements, drawn by the boy. He had anticipated our return. And on the bottom, meticulously labeled, was a small, empty, rectangular box with an arrow pointing to the location on the map where the canvases were found. The box was labeled, in tiny, neat handwriting, "The Drop." He knew we would return. He had left the paintings for us. And then Leo saw the final detail. On the drawing, there were faint, almost erased pencil marks that showed a fourth stick figure, the boy himself positioned not outside the door, but above the main gear, in the shadowy rafters, watching us on his drawn plan. He wasn't gone. He had never left. He was still in the tower, and he had orchestrated our return to collect his work. We heard the sound before we saw anything. It was a sharp, sudden click, coming from the central mechanism of the clock. It wasn't the slow, regular tick-tock. It was a mechanical shift, a lever being thrown. Then, the main, 10-foot gear that Leo was still standing next to began to turn. It started slowly, with a grinding, protesting screech, the same sound I had heard a few days prior. It was not a timekeeping cycle. It was too fast, too violent. "Get down!" Simon screamed. Leo jumped off the pedestal as the giant gear picked up speed. The teeth were whipping past now, and the entire chamber began to fill with a deafening, frantic C-L-A-C-K-C-L-A-C-K-C-L-A-C-K of moving machinery. And then we saw him. The boy. He was perched high up on a narrow beam above the gear, partially hidden in the darkness of the cupola, looking down at us. He was smaller than I thought, impossibly thin, clad in a dirty t-shirt. He had a look on his face that wasn't menacing, but utterly vacant. Those same wide, hollow eyes from the portraits. He wasn't operating the clock. He was in the clock. He had a lever in his hand, a small, worn piece of metal that he had somehow inserted into the intricate workings, forcing the mechanism to seize and turn violently. He was breaking the clock. He wasn't trying to hurt us with the gears. He was making noise. He looked down at us, directly at me, a silent, terrifying figure in the darkness. Then, he raised his free hand and made one simple, slow motion. He pointed at the three of us, then pointed at the canvas in Simon's bag. Then, he pointed to his own hollow, painted eyes. It was a final, horrifying gesture. "You have taken what is mine. Now I have seen what is yours." We scrambled for the stairs, the sound of the grinding clockwork, a physically painful, deafening roar in the small room. We didn't stop running until we were outside the building and a block away, gasping for breath. The terrifying, persistent fear of his gaze, now a physical reality. We told no one. We burned the 3 portraits in my backyard incinerator the next morning. They turned to ash, but the image of those eyes remained burned into my mind. The town clock stopped working completely that day. The official report said a main shaft had snapped due to metal fatigue. It took months to repair. We never saw the boy again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a large, silent room, I catch myself glancing at the periphery of my vision, convinced that a pair of wide, empty eyes is watching, and that somewhere there is a final, blank canvas waiting for my complete, observed fear.